So first of all, hello. Thank you very much for joining us today. If we've not met, I'm Rachel Murphy. I'm the NPMS Volunteer Manager, and I am joined today by Botanical Specialist Ben Averis, who is going to be taking us through these very varied and important group of habitats, flushes and springs, which actually we get a fair few questions on within the scheme from our volunteers. So this session is part of our training programme for our NPMS volunteers, but of course, welcome to anyone new to the scheme or anybody at all interested to find out more.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, I do have plenty to get through in that I produced a document that's, I can't remember how many pages it is. It's long enough that I can't be too slow going through it, otherwise we'll run the risk of running past the hour. So I'm going to, hang on. Get on to the next page, title page, yeah, obviously. So after that, brief outline page of what this presentation includes, which is stuff about the definition of springs and flushes, how they relate to the NPMS habitat categories, broad habitats and fine scale habitat subdivision things, characteristic plant species that we find in these places, and some photos of examples of these, of the habitats and the species. Okay, and that's another title page that I did for original PDF version. I thought I'd put that in there. I forgot to go into all the trouble of making the springs and flushes title, all letters in different colours to reflect variation in species and so on. Okay, so from the point of view of definition, very simply, really, springs, as I've said, they're places where water comes out of the ground. So they're kind of very small locations, really, where you've got this very particular kind of hydrology, and the vegetation is typically including a lot or dominance, really, of mosses and liverworts. Flushes are bigger scale habitats. They can be quite long and narrow and come down from a spring up at the top of a flush. Or they can, or as such, they can be very well defined. You can pick them out visually quite easily, or they can be more kind of diffuse, and they can be very wide with sort of gradual edges at the side. So it kind of is a bit more tricky to decide exactly where the flush ends. And the water source for a flush is not always just a spring at the top. It might be sort of general wetness coming down the slope. It might be a place where frequently there's a lot of rainwater just gradually coming down the slope where it sort of collects and comes down. So it's kind of rather varied groundwater and other kind of water source contributing to that. That's flushing. Okay, and the flushes, by the way, have a more varied mix of vegetation types. Bigger plants, vascular plants play more of a role on the whole in flushes than they do in springs. But mosses and liverworts can be very common throughout. It's just that in the springs you don't get so many of the vascular plants that you can actually see the mosses a lot more clearly. In relation to the NPMS habitat categories, springs and flushes are mostly in the marsh and fen broad habitat, within which they straddle the acid and the base-rich subdivisions. But you also get kind of flush wet heaths, so which we could call a heathy flush, really. So part of the bog and wet heath broad habitat also includes some kind of flush vegetation. And so when we're thinking about springs and flushes in relation to places to go doing NPMS work, we can ask ourselves which NPMS broad habitats are we in, which we want to do anyway, marsh fen or wet heath stroke bog. And if it's in marsh fen, the second question, is it the acid or base-rich subdivision? And this is something that has come up in a previous NPMS presentation that I did, all just about the marsh and fen broad habitats. But it's worth checking it out here again with a more specifically sort of spring flush way of looking at things, because not all marsh fen is spring or flush. And then whichever NPMS habitat it's in, how are we going to tell if it's a spring or flush from sort of marsh or fen or wet heath that isn't really flushed or a spring? Okay, so the first question there, is it marsh fen or is it wet heath and bog? Generally, wet heath and bog vegetation is more heathy. But yeah, wet heath and bog, that broad habitat includes bog, which definitely is not ever going to be spring or flush because of its particular hydrology. So if you have a lot of hairstail cotton grass or certain sphagnum species, the big ochre sphagnum papillosum or the big red sphagnum medium, or bog rosemary and cranberry as well, those things are very characteristic of bogs. So this is assuming that if you're in bog stroke wet heath, that you've eliminated bog, that you're sure it's actually wet heath rather than bog. If it's wet heath, you're probably going to be looking at a fair bit of heather or cross-leaved heath or deer grass. These are things that you don't really see so much of in the marsh stroke fen NPMS broad habitat. So that's just a wee bit there at the beginning about separation, about checking which broad habitat you're in. And if you're in the bog wet heath, that you are in wet heath and not bog. So assuming now that you're in marsh and fen, which is going to be the commonest situation for any kind of flush or spring habitat, then are you going to be in the acid or base rich subdivision? Always going to want to know that. And what I've done here is pick out a group of species, quite a big group of species actually, that are ones that you can take note of to help you decide which of those categories you're in. Specifically, these are specifically species that you get quite commonly in springs and flushes. There are other kinds of species that you can get in marsh and fen broad habitat that aren't really spring or flush species, so not bothering with those here. And I think I said this before in the previous marsh and fen one, that when it comes to separating the acid and base rich types, mosses are quite telling, actually, even though they're strictly not in the remit of NPMS. But I've put them in here, put quite a few of them in here, actually, because they really do help that way. Polytrichum commune, this big thing that looks like a moss with leaves like miniature conifer needles, is a very good one to point us in the acid direction. These first pictures I've got here are all sort of acid fine scale subdivision of marsh and fen, and then we move on to the base rich subdivision. So polytrichums, easy to identify with those needle-like leaves, and Polytrichum commune is by far the commonest kind of polytrichum that you will get in any kind of wet place. There's also Polytrichum strictum, which is really a bog plant, and you can separate the two, especially if you've got a hand lens. Check out the leaf margin, and little teeth on the edge means it's going to be commune and not strictum. And yeah, they're big enough mosses, easy to see that feature. Sphagnum mosses is the other group that really are common in the acid subtype of marsh and fen, and they're quite variable, as you can see there. It's a couple of species: Sphagnum phalax, Sphagnum palustri. Sphagnum palustri is one of these sort of big, chunky kind of sphagnums with big, broad, concave branch leaves that makes the whole branch look very kind of fat. Sphagnum phalax, one with smaller, thinner branch leaves, thinner looking branches, much more fine looking plant. There are lots of different sphagnums. As a general rule, they're most common in the acid places. Here's another one, different one. Actually, this one is this Sphagnum auriculatum, with lovely golden color, the dark stem. It's particularly common in flushed places, although it also occurs in bog pools, which are very, very different kind of habitat. But away from bog pools, it's so commonly associated with places where water flows laterally, kind of flushing, and generally kind of on the acid side as well. And here's another easy to recognize moss, Aulacomnium palustri, very common in all sorts of acid wet places, including springs and flushes and bogs and other things as well. But yeah, you're very likely to find this often growing with sphagnum. Big, long, narrow leaves, contrasting with a dark, thick, brown-looking stem, which only looks thick and brown because its stem is actually a bit thinner, but the stem is covered in kind of felty stuff. A lot of wetland mosses have this kind of felty stuff called tomentum. It's an easy thing to recognize, and it kind of creeps around. It's quite a big moss as well. It catches the eye. Dichodontium palustri, it's a smaller thing. The individual shoots are smaller, but the whole plant can form great big spongy looking mats in acid places, especially springs, really. And some acid flushes as well. Interesting one, the leaves are slightly bent backwards. There's not that many mosses do that. Actually, one of the commonest ones that does that, the commonest moss that has leaves bent backwards is Phytodelphus sclerosus, which is really common in garden lawns. But in that species, the leaves taper to a very fine, quite sharp point, whereas in this one, Dichodontium palustri, they end in quite a blunt point. So it's pretty easy to recognize. Bright color as well. You can often pick it out from a distance. In contrast to this thing, which is very grey. This is a tiny, well, the individual shoots are tiny, little liverworts of a very silvery grey color, little branch shoots, but they grow together in such big masses. It's a kind of beautiful silvery color. They form kind of sponge-like masses in places where the water emerges from the ground, acid water emerging from the ground in the mountains. And sometimes in flushy bits as well, but especially common in little acid springs in mountain areas. Okay, so that's quite easy to tell. Another liverwort of acid springs is Scapinia undulata. The close-up photograph on the left is its kind of, I suppose, default color of a dullish browny green, but it can be kind of brighter green or purplish or reddish, as we see in the photograph on the right. Variegated colors, pretty common in lots of upland acid springs and flushes too. Okay, some vascular plants now that we find in springs and flushes. On the whole, there are not that many vascular plant species that are really characteristic of acid springs and flushes compared with base-rich springs and flushes, in which we get lots of vascular plant species that are found commonly there, but not in the acid ones, as we'll see in a bit. But here are a few vascular plants in these places. Bog pondweed with these shiny oval leaves, green to brownish green. They're very common in these peaty, very, very wet flushes and soakways. Not so much the springs, but flushes and soakways. Marsh St. John's wort. If you're in the southwest, or the extreme west, a bit further north, like in the Outer Hebrides, then you can see this instantly recognizable herb with these broad, rounded, pale, grayish-looking, grayish-green leaves. They look pale and grayish-green because they're so incredibly hairy, really, really hairy, and little yellow flowers on it. You don't even need the flowers to identify it. It's really obvious even without them. It likes, like the bog pondweed, it likes kind of very wet, usually rather acid, flushy, soakway places. Marsh violet, this is a really common plant, more widespread than that last one. Typical violet leaves, but they're a bit rounder and a bit more of a yellowy green than those of the common dog violet, which is about our commonest violet. The common dog violet grows in drier places and the marsh violet in wetter ones, especially wet acid places. So acid flushes and some acid springs as well are good habitat for it. The flower is a little bit paler than the flower of the common dog violet as well. So roundy, sort of paler, yellowy green leaves, very characteristic thing there. And these two are very common in acid flushes and some springs as well. But they also will grow in the more base-rich ones as well. But probably maybe slightly more in the acid side. They straddle them really. Lesser spearwort. This is like a buttercup with very narrow, simple-looking leaves and slightly narrower petals than the usual buttercups. And the marsh willow herb, typical willow herb-looking thing, but the leaves are very, very narrow compared with most other willow herbs. So they're common wetland species that straddling acid and base-rich NPMS subdivisions of marsh and fen. And Montia fontana blinks, a little tiny thing that's really common. It can be actually locally dominant in some springs, sort of acid springs really, or also ones that are sort of rather neutral. And in NPMS, marsh and fen, neutral puts it into base-rich, because even though in a wider sense we can recognize acid wetlands, neutral wetlands, and truly base-rich wetlands. In the NPMS scheme, acid ones are in the acid fine-scale habitat. Neutral and base-rich ones are both put together in what's called the base-rich one. So those last two species we saw straddle both NPMS subdivisions, and so does this one, the Montia fontana. Flowers are so tiny and inconspicuous. There aren't any in that photograph, but it's quite, the leaves are widest towards the tip, and they're quite blunt. So it's actually quite an easy thing to tell, these little pairs of opposite pairs of leaves of an obovate shape. Okay, and in the same sorts of places, if you're in the southwestern sort of half of Britain and Ireland, then you can, or Southeast Ireland anyway, then you might get this kind of little buttercup, white flower buttercup, round-leaved crowfoots in fairly acid, kind of soakaway places, really, or very, very wet flushes or rills, you know, especially on hillsides. And it looks rather similar to another one called ivy-leaved crowfoot, which actually has rather different habitat, maybe kind of more nutrient-enriched and not really so acid. I've put them both in there to help tell the difference. Different shape of leaf, really. The ivy-leaved one is rather an ivy-shaped leaf. You don't get ivy leaves looking the colour of the top one. You look looking the shape of the top one, not the colour, sorry. Okay, next one, starry saxifrage. If you're up in mountain areas, you can be very likely to see this one in springs and some flushes that are acid. So little kind of rosettes of oval leaves with a few teeth scattered along them, and flowers with these 5 petals that are very narrow with a lot of space between the petals. And it's often a reddish tinge to the leaves. And the leaves have a slightly kind of thick texture, almost slightly succulent nature to them. Quite distinctive little plants, scattered little rosettes, scattered plants among mosses in these springs in mountain areas. So that's another acid one, really. Mainly acid. So as I said, there weren't very many of those, so we got through those ones fairly quickly, and now we can look at some species of the springs and flushes we get in the base-rich fine-scale habitat, which is kind of on reflecting kind of conditions that are more neutral to truly base-rich. So there's quite a wide span here of sort of acidity and species. Mosses, starting with mosses again, because there are quite a few of these, and some of them are really easy to identify. So if you see this spiky looking thing called Calliogonella, golden and spiky looking because the leaves are all kind of wrapped into a point at the tips of the stems and some of the branches, then that's going to be a good indicator that it's not really so acid, more kind of neutral to base rich, and putting you in the base rich NPMS fine scale type. Nice looking moss. And another one with like the Calliogonella, it's kind of branched, quite pinnately branched, branches coming out on the left and right, but it's not so golden and it's not so spiky, but it's got a nice silvery tip to the stems and some of the branches. That's Brachythecium rivulari. Again, that likes the same kind of not quite so acid wetlands, common in the base-rich fine-scale habitat of marsh and fen, often accompanied by the Calliogonella. And there's these things, Philanotis, they look a bit stringy because they're not very branched, and the leaves are really very short, especially in Philanotis fontana, the left-hand one, which is much the commoner of these two. And Philanotis fontana will grow occasionally in some more acid places, but more commonly where it's about more or less neutral. And you often get big patches of it. Quite distinctive thing, stringy look about it. Philanotis calcarea, as its name suggests, is in more calcareous places. It's not so common. Really likes strongly calcareous springs and flushes. And its leaves are a little bit longer and slightly curved over at the tips. But again, the branches, the stems aren't very branched. So when you pull an individual shoot out, it kind of looks a bit stringy. Okay, next one, Campylium. This is a pretty easy one to recognize, and it's a good indicator that it's a bit base-enriched. It's a base-enriched flush species mainly. It's quite golden colored, and the leaves are pretty narrow, and they stick out quite widely in all directions. Not so widely as to start pointing backwards, like the other species that we saw. but sort of, yeah, widely enough that when you look at it from above, you get something of a star-like appearance, hence the name stellatum there. So easy to recognize and base enriched indicator, base enrichment. And these things, you could call them collectively, you could say hook mosses, because the leaves are all curled over to one side. And that shows especially well at the tips of the shoots and the tips of the branches. Various species, I won't go into all the details of how to separate them here, but they vary in size, like Scorpidium scorpioides, there is the biggest, great big chunky thing, and often a sort of browny to purpley colour. Palastriella commutator can be really, really golden, so much so as to be able to pick patches of it out from quite a distance away. So yeah, as a group, they feature very, very much among the mosses of strongly base-enriched flushes, base-rich springs and flushes. This one as well, this likes it kind of neutral to base-rich, a lovely little thing. The shoots aren't branched very much, just lots and lots of them sticking up upright, bearing leaves that are sort of oval and that stick out quite widely. A bit like the Campyllium we saw, the golden one, the leaves stick out widely, but here the leaves are a bit broader and they're more spaced out, so you can see those individual leaves a lot more clearly. And the stems, you often find the stems are quite reddish, contrasting with the green leaves. Nice little thing, common in the base-rich subdivision of marsh and fen, in springs and in flushes. So that's a few mosses there. Now some vascular plants, to be more of these. Because there are plenty of vascular plants that grow in flushy places on soils that vary from neutral to base enriched, and they're therefore in this NPMS subtype. This is always easy one to identify, opposite leaf golden saxifrage, because the leaves are kind of a small thing, low carpets it forms on the ground, and the leaves are in opposite pairs, and they're kind of quite round with biggish rounded teeth around the edges. And little yellow flowers earlier in the year. Easy thing to tell. Then next one, here's another couple of quite distinctive ones. Butterwort, unmistakable leaves. They're kind of bright, yellowy, rather pale yellowy green leaves with inrolled margins, and they're kind of sticky because they catch flies, and that's how one of the ways that the plant gets its nutrients. And the yellow saxifrage. The yellow saxifrage is a species really of the Scottish Highlands and Hebrides and the Lake District, and locally in the North Pennines as well. I think it grows in the North Pennines, but in springs and flushes to really base enriched, that yellow flowered one is a really strong indicator of base enrichment. Leaves are rather fleshy, albeit narrow, so it's an easy one to identify. These things are much smaller. The bog pimpernel is a low trailing thing with little roundish leaves in opposite pairs and little flowers, actually little, but relatively large compared with the size of the leaves. Little flowers with 5 petals, kind of whitish to pale pinkish. It likes a sort of neutral to slightly base enriched flushy bit of ground. And the little pale butterwort is like a real miniature version of the ordinary butterwort. It's much smaller, leaves are really inrolled around the edges, and they're kind of a duller pale browny green colour, and the flowers are much, much smaller. And it does very well in sort of base enriched flushes in the West, really, where you find that. Lady smock, very common, well-known plants. It can get quite big and lush, like the one photographed on the right there, and can be looking like that in some flushes, but in springs we often see it just really very short, little kind of basal rosette of leaves, and not so much in the way of flowers. Leaves quite easy to tell, really. They have these opposite pairs of leaflets, often with a bit of a purpley tinge to them. Nice thing. Flowers fairly early, well, April, May, June time. And marsh marigold. Flowers are it's like a buttercup, but bigger because it's in the buttercup family. And the leaves are heart-shaped with sort of rounded teeth around the edges, and they're quite firm textured leaves, and they can get quite big. Easy plant to tell. The leaves look a bit like those of the lesser celandine, Ficaria verna, but they're much bigger and tougher textured, and the flowers are much, much bigger as well. And it grows in wet places, especially on fairly neutral soils. So it's an easy one. Bed straws, a couple of bed straws that we find in this habitat. Marsh bed straw on the left with kind of 4 or 5 or even up to 6 leaves in a whorl. And often in marsh bed straw, the leaves are a bit irregular in their sort of size within the whorl, a bit untidy looking there, compared with the fen bed straw, where you get 6 to 8 in a whorl, and they're more evenly spaced and more evenly sized and tapering to a nice fine point more than they do in the marsh bed straw. They both like sort of wet places that are neutral to slightly basic. The fen bed straw, probably a little bit more on the side of more base enriched for that one. And fen bed straw not quite as common as the marsh bed straw. So they both point us in the direction of the base rich fine scale habitats of marsh and fen. As do these 3, marsh hawksbeard, whose leaves are a bit like dandelion because they've got backward pointing teeth on their edges, or some of the teeth point backwards. Not very many species of plants have backward pointing teeth, but it's obviously not dandelion because the leaf is more pointed and it's got these tall stems which are branched. Dandelion is never branched. And ragged robin, unmistakable flowers. Leaves are in opposite pairs. They're a bit sort of duller and less conspicuous, less obvious leaves. But actually, when you get your eye for the leaves of ragged robin, you can pick them out quite well. Opposite pairs, and they get wide slightly beyond the middle to the widest parts, and they're sort of medium to slightly darkish green. Subtle looking thing, but yeah, quite recognizable really. I'm telling you this and I haven't got a photograph of the leaves there. I should have put a photograph, but you can't get the whole plant in there very easily. Anyway, I've got the leaves of this one though, marsh pennyworts, because it's the leaves there that really identify it, and you don't so often see the flowers much anyway. Round leaves, absolutely round, with those sort of crenulate, rounded, shallow teeth around the edges, unmistakable. Okay, 4 on this page. It's testing my ability to try and get through these things not too slowly, with more and more on a page. Marsh thistle. It's kind of like, you might say, like other thistles, like the ordinary creeping thistle, except it's got more spines, because creeping thistle doesn't have the spines on the actual stems, it's just on the leaves. And it's got this kind of dark look about it because the leaves have a kind of purpley tinge all the way around the margins of the leaves. And there's a bit of a purpley tinge on the stem, and the flowers a bit of a darker, slightly darker purpley colour than the that of the very common creeping thistle. So dark purpley kind of thing. And it grows in sort of wetlands especially. Water avens, lovely drooping, dull, pinky kind of flowers. Yellow flag, unmistakable, great big long leaves occurring in flattened sort of tufts, like they've all been squashed into one plane, and the unmistakable yellow flowers. And meadowsweet with those creamy flowers and leaves with opposite pairs of leaflets, with little tiny miniature kind of leaflets things in between the opposite pairs as well. Quite an odd feature. And a whole page for this one, grass of, because that previous page, by the way, was more or less copied from previous thing about marsh and fen that I did. But I've added a few more species for this purpose, so I've given the whole page here. Grass of Parnassus, what a beautiful plant. Leaves are a bit like those of the violets, but they're grayer, and they're quite hairless and a sort of firmer texture than your typical violet leaf, so it doesn't really look like violet. And the flowers, buttercup sized, 5 petals like buttercups, but they're white. And when they're in bud, they have that distinctive look, like you see on the left there, like a little round white thing. A beautiful plant. Base enriched flushes, generally an indicator of pretty good quality habitat, this one. What's next? Valerians, with flowers that are kind of white to very pale pink. The common valerians, obviously the commonest and the most widespread, and all its leaves have these leaflets on the left and right sides in opposite pairs. Whereas in the marsh valerian, which is more southern, it only just comes up into Scotland. It's not common up here at all. And its basal leaves are not divided in this way. They're just a kind of simple oval leaf. It's the ones at the stems that have the typical valerian shape. And even those, you can still tell they're different from common valerian because it's the end lobe is much bigger than the other ones. And it's an early flower too. But they both species like a habitat that's kind of neutral to base rich, so it's the base rich subdivision of marsh and fen. Bog asphodel, this is a good one. It's actually pretty common in the acid habitats, the acid subdivision of marsh and fen, and also grows in other habitats as well, like wet heaths and bogs. But I've put it in here partly to compare with this other thing, a little like a miniature version of it, the Scottish asphodel, which is very much a base-rich wetland indicator, kind of base-rich flushes in the mountains, mainly in the Highlands in Scotland. And it's a lovely little thing. The flowers are not that conspicuous. They're on they're kind of little clusters, a bit like a little pale plantain even. But nevertheless, you can pick them out. But the leaves are really distinctive, a little flattened group of leaves all in one plane, as is the case in the bog asphodel and the yellow flag iris that we saw earlier, which is much, much bigger. So, but little fan-shaped group of leaves in a flattened plane in amongst the mosses of the base-rich flush, and that's typical Scottish asphodel habitat. Good indicator of base enrichment. Buttercups are pretty common in springs and flushes. We're talking here really about the meadow buttercup and the creeping buttercup. And if that spring or flush has been quite nutrient enriched, like maybe by runoff from fertilized fields nearby or anything like that, then the creeping buttercup is very much on the cards. And you can tell it's different leaf shape there with like a hole in the middle because it's got separate leaflets on the left and right side, and then a bit of stalk, and then the main, then sort of end leaflets. And the leaflets individually are all quite cut up as well, often with those pale blotches on them. Meadow buttercup, it's not leaflets, it's just lobes, so it's all joined together in the middle. Looks quite different. And the meadow buttercup is more common in what you might say are some of the better examples from a sort of conservation or condition point of view, better examples of kind of neutral flush, and where it's not been kind of eutrophicated. But you can often get both species coexisting together as overlapping habitat. Okay, sedges. Sedges feature quite big in a lot of the springs and flushes, even and in acid ones as well. So I've put in some here that that straddle acid and base-rich subdivisions of the NPMS marsh and fen. I won't go into all the details of how to separate, how to identify these 5 species because that'll take too long, but they are there. Oh, and by the way, when I'm putting these things in this document and I'm saying I put this stuff in and I'm not going to go through all the details just now, that is knowing that knowing that you're going to be able to have this document at a later stage and go through it more. So you'll be able to do that. It's not like it's now or never. Anyway, yeah, carnations, common sedge, carnation sedge, glaucus, bottle, and star sedges, all in between them a kind of mix of acid and more base-rich places. They're all quite easily recognizable sedges, and they're all pretty common. And the same is true of these ones, common yellow sedge. That's that one, and the flea sedge, which is unmistakable, especially about this time of year, or going back a bit in the last couple of months, really, when it's in fruit. And those little fruits there sort of point backwards, and nothing else like that. These are both species that really are most common in the more base-enriched flushes. Okay, and cotton grasses, they're also sedges. Cotton grasses are in the sedge family, and we saw the hairtail cotton grass earlier on. That's a bog species, completely different. But these ones with leaves more like typical sedge leaves are found in quite a lot of flushes. The common cotton grass is common in acid flushes, but also some more base-rich ones. The broadleaf cotton grass, which is less common, is very much a base-rich indicator. It's got leaves that are shorter than those of common cotton grass, and that solid spear-like bit at the end is not so long in broadleaf cotton grass. It's ridiculously long in the common cotton grass. They're not difficult species to tell. Broadleaf cotton grass grows taller, and sometimes you can pick that out because it kind of waves about in the wind. And sometimes you can see it from a distance as I've done sometimes, and thought, that looks like broadleaf cotton grass over there, and it might be 50 meters away. And it's quite fun, quite good if you do go there and you find that it is broadleaf cotton grass. Sometimes, yeah, you can pick these things out from a bit of a distance. Okay, what's next? Black bog rush. This is easy to tell because the leaves are thin and wiry and they come in dense tussocks, a bit like the leaves of hare's tail cotton grass. But the flowers are in these dark heads near the tips of the stems. And the leaves go very, very pale and persist right through the winter in pale tussocks. And it's a plant of base-rich flushes for the most part. In the west of Ireland and some places in the west of Scotland, it can also grow in acid bogs, but it's mainly a base-rich indicator on flushed ground. And here are a couple of actually uncommon things, but things to look out for if you're, especially in hill districts, if you're in springs and flushes. There's deer grass. I had a photo of it earlier on, ordinary deer grass, which is very common in acid, wet heaths and bogs. But if you see a thing that looks like deer grass and the stems are a bit thinner than and more curved than you're usually used to seeing, because deer grass normally very straight stems. If they're kind of a bit curved and thin, flimsier looking, it might be the northern deer grass, which is not so common and actually grows in base-rich flushes, which is not really the habitat of the ordinary deer grass. And put a link there to Jeremy Roberts's websites. He's got this brilliant website about what a lot of people might think are really dull-looking plants, but you know, they're great plants. They're interesting things, and they tell us a lot about the environment, and some of them are uncommon. And he's got this thing about spike rushes and deer grasses, how to separate them all. And so that's the place to find out more details about the northern deer grass. It's a lovely plant, probably under-recorded, you know. And likewise, sheathed sedge. It looks a bit like carnation sedge, but it's not so bluey-grey tinged. And it doesn't always flower. You often get just the leaves. I've put a picture of a leaf at the bottom. They're sort of a dull yellowish green color, and they're parallel-sided almost to the tip, and then they're kind of quite shortly pointed, not really blunt, but just all the points are pointing at the end happens in a short distance. So quite distinctive leaves, really, and these broad sheathing bracts around the female flowers, and a very short, broad leaf at the base of the stem, probably under-recorded, because it's quite common in very, very locally in some parts of the Highlands, like parts of Perthshire, for example. So it's another thing worth looking out for if you're in flush ground in those places. Rushes are very common in flushes and some springs, but especially in flushes. These are the tufty ones with flowers in little bunches on the sides of the stems. I won't go into all the details. We've had them before in other NPMS things, especially the ordinary marsh and fen one, because they grow in quite a range of habitats. Variation in the flowers and in the stem color, and whether it's a smooth stem or grooves on the stem will help us to separate the species. And between them, they straddle acid to really quite strongly base enriched kind of habitats. Hence, I put A's and B's in there to help with the NPMS fine scale habitats. Likewise, for the rushes that have all their flowers mainly at the top of the stem, in little branched clusters, or quite big branched clusters, really. So these rushes and the previous page rushes can help us to decide which subtype of NPMS we're in sort of flushy habitats. Again, flushes more than springs. That's a whole load of photos of individual species or groups of species characteristic of springs and flushes. I've now got some photos that just show what the habitat looks like, really, from a little bit of a distance. We've seen one or two of those bits, glimpses of that already, but here are a little collection of them. So these ones are acid springs. I can tell I've been going through this a bit faster than the last presentation I did, because my coffee is still warm enough to drink. I'm looking at the clock there. We're not behind schedule, I think. acid springs, what you often see from a bit of a distance in an acid spring is a kind of, you could call it an acidy green color, really. A sort of yellowy green color features a lot among the mosses and some of the liverworts that grow very commonly in those sorts of places. Although we've got the silvery color of the Anthelia liverwort down at the bottom right there, which is obviously different. But yeah, those are some acid springs. We don't get a great deal of vascular plant growth in acid springs on the whole, mostly mosses and liverworts. Here are some photos of more kind of neutral springs, and because they're neutral ones, they go into the NPMS base-rich subdivision rather than the acid subdivision. And it's we can get a different group of mosses like that spiky Calliogonella moss, or the more green and silvery Brachythecium rivulari moss that we saw earlier. Often we get quite a few herbs in these kind of habitats, and you can see there's little leaves of some rushes and sedges growing in it. So not quite so consistently moss or liverwort dominated. So here we've got, for example, those yellow flowers of marsh marigold in the one on the top right. Another vascular plant that can be really, really common in neutral springs is the blinks that I showed a photo of earlier, with all those tiny little obovate-shaped green leaves in opposite pairs, and you can thicken up to sort of masses, almost looking like a sort of moss at a bit of a distance. So quite different, really, to the acid springs, these ones. And then here are some photos of a couple of more truly base-rich springs, and they can have a sort of more strongly golden kind of color, golden to browny color, more saturated sort of color about them, especially where the dominant species is the moss Palastriella. There's Palastriella commutator that I had a photo of among those hook mosses. And there's another one that's closely related called Palastriella falcata, which is very, very similar, but the branches are a bit sparser than they are in commutator. Basically, hook mosses are a very strongly golden color, and they're quite robust things, and they can thicken up into bright golden masses that you can see from a fair distance. And that helps to pick out a bit of a base-rich spring. So they can have quite a bit of a different look, not so much of a kind of acid or apple green that we often see in the acid springs, more of a sort of warm, goldeny color. And then some photos of some flushes, again, starting with acid ones. So these are flushes that have sphagnum moss growing in extensive carpets beneath sedges. The sedge on the left is common sedge, Carex nigra, and the one on the right is bottle sedge, it's a bit bigger. As you can see, it looks more lush. And they're both very much acid flushes that are very common in the hills. So we can, and in the sedge-dominated ones, compared with the more rush or herb-dominated flushes, you can often see the moss layer quite easily through the sedges, or even if you can't, you can get down there and part the plants away and check out what the mosses are. It's often such a useful thing to do. But yeah, sphagnum mosses with sedges there in these acid flushes. And here it's more kind of sphagnum mosses with rushes. As I say, the rushes hide the view of a lot of the mosses because they're big rushes. Soft rush on the left and sharp flowered rush on the right, but these are in acid places, acid flushes. And in the summer time, you can often get a good clue from a bit of a distance for picking out the acid from the more kind of neutral or base rich rush dominated flushes. And that is on the basis of like how much you see of colourful flowers overtopping the rushes, things like buttercups and meadowsweet and angelica and ragged robin. So even though you can get the same species of rush, as we have here, sharp-flowered and soft brush, being really abundant or even dominant in a flush, which is either, it can be an acid or in the NPMS base-rich type, we can check them out by getting in there and looking certainly at the mosses and other sort of herbs in there, but we might get a good clue at a bit of a distance if we see spots of colour growing among the rushes from a bit of a distance. It's going to hint that it's not going to be the acid one. As we see here, these are flushes that are kind of neutral flushes really, and that puts them in the base-rich NPMS fine-scale habitat. Pinks and yellows of the flowers of ragged robin and buttercups, among other things there. A greater vascular plant species diversity on the whole as well in the neutral and basic ones compared with the more acid ones. So quite colourful habitats, a mix of sedges and rushes and herbs and mosses. Well, you can see the leaves of the iris there as well in the one on the left. And that straight away is going to tell us this is not going to be an acid flush. It's going to be one that's going to be in the NPMS base-rich fine-scale habitat. Some base-rich flushes, especially, funnily enough, some of the more strongly base-enriched flushes can actually look, you might say, rather dull, visually speaking. This applies in particular to the ones where the vegetation is quite short or sparse and open as well, where it's got a lot of moss, but not quite so much of a diversity of vascular species. Maybe a few sedges being the main vascular species, along with some of the mosses. Obviously, the mosses, if you got some of those hook moss species or the starry Campylum stellatum that we saw photos of earlier, then straight away that's going to tell us base-rich. But it's surprising how, when we're in some of these base-rich flushes, and we can find quite interesting mixtures of all sorts of mosses and very small herbs, like that pale butterwort, for example, things like that, or some rare sedges even, that we think, oh, this is what a great place to be. I'll take a photograph of it. And then when you look at the photograph, you think, oh, it doesn't look much, hardly looks that distinguishable from the vegetation to the sides, really, in the photo. But when we're there, we can pick out this richness. So the photo on the left, it's not a very, some might say it looks rather dull, but it's not a dull place to be botanically at all. Some flushes can be really very broad, especially if the slope is pretty gentle and quite smooth without sort of having sort of runnel things coming down. It's just really a smooth, broad sweep of slope that's uniformly, mildly to reasonably flushed, water just seeping through, right through across a big width of it. So you can get a wide flush, as in the case here. This is mainly sedges and herbs of species that indicate there's some base enrichment there. It's up in Aberdeenshire earlier this summer. And it's not quite so clear exactly where we are going to map if we're mapping vegetation, where we're going to map the very edges. They can sort of blend in sideways into other kinds of less flushed habitat. And here's another example where it's Molinia, purple moorgrass vegetation, but flushing showing with these species like ragged robin there. And we also can bear in mind that the neutral damp grassland NPMS type can look a bit like a rushy flush, but it's more grassy. It's the main way of telling it. Grasses, certain grasses, as I've named species there, feature very much in that category, whereas in the marsh stroke fen, one equivalent is going to be mainly rushes, sedges, herbs and mosses. Wet heath, I've mentioned wet heath earlier on. Here's an example of wet heath that is flushed. So you've got things like Narthecium, there's the yellow flowers, it's like a yellow orchid of the bog asphodel. and there's some quaking grass in there, not that you can really see it, but you can get a whole lot of species that indicate base enrichment growing in a flushed wet heath. Here is this example in Perthshire, where we've got meadowsweet in there, and the white flowers to the left of sneezewort, Achillea tarmica, buttercups, some lady's bedstraw, all plants of not so much acid places, but more neutral to base-rich habitats. So it's flushed wet heath. It's a wonderful habitat, flushed wet heath. Some wet heath is flushed, but it's very acid. And bog asphodel is one of the species that you get in there that helps to show the flushing. And this little moss, quite a rare one, Campylopus shorii in the Hebrides especially, is a feature of acid flushes among wet heaths. I'd mentioned, how do you tell spring and flush for something that isn't spring and flush? It's a bit vague because there's not a strict list of absolute flush and spring indicators, but of all the species that we've had so far in this presentation, this list of species here should help as being the ones that are the strongest indicators of flushing versus no flushing. Okay, let's go on to, I've got one thing, a question. In some of these things, well, most of these I've actually put some questions. I've only done this one here, so as not to slow us down too much. And this is, but if you got as in this photo, some jointed rush, which is a species found mainly on neutral to base-rich soils, growing in a carpet of sphagnum on a flushed slope. Are we going to put that in the acid or the base-rich subdivision of NPMS, marsh, and fen? So jointed rush in itself would take us in the direction of base-rich subdivision because it likes neutral to base-rich soil. It's got sphagnum growing in it. So I'm not going to wait for a whole load of answers in any kind of official question and answer session manner, so as not to slow us down. But it's an understandable dilemma that somebody might be in when faced with this. Sheets of sphagnum growing under jointed rush. Looking a bit more in the vegetation, you can see the pink flowers of ragged robin, little white blobs of, in this case, it's fen bedstraw. The moss is sphagnum angustifolium. And even though one might say sphagnum must mean it's acid, it doesn't always, because there are some sphagnums that like it not quite so acid. And what are we going to do about that? There's a list of them there. As I put maybe 3 options. Learn to identify them all. Not everybody's got the time for that or the inclination. Forget about it and just say sphagnum is acid. No, not really, because now it's been raised and said it isn't always acid. You can't forget about it. Look for any other clues if there are any, and there usually are. What usually you find is that if you've got a sphagnum that likes it less acid, growing very commonly on the ground, then it's likely to be accompanied by at least a smattering of some of those herbs or some of those other mosses that are indicators of it being a bit base-rich, not so acid. So that's the thing to look out for, as in this case we had the ragged robin, the fen bedstraw, and the rush itself, the jointed rush. Some negative indicators, we don't, we get the lists of them in all the NPMS types. They generally indicate eutrophication or disturbance of some kind, as do these. Or in the case of tufted hair grass, like if it's not too grazed, the felting can get to dominate at the expense of other plants. And if we're in wet heath, we've got another lot of indicators of, again, eutrophication or disturbance for the main part. So rather than end with the negative species, let's just end here with a picture of the different sphagnums, to the sphagnum species of places where it's not quite so acid. These are slightly more base demanding sphagna. Great plants. If you ever do get into looking at more sphagnums, it's well worth it. And so that brings us to the end of its 5 minutes before the hour is up. In the hope that that's been of some interest, and thank you all, for coming here, having the interest to come here in the first place. I've just noticed we've got 60 participants.
No, it's
Really
incredible.
interesting.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was really interesting, really useful, and incredibly well timed. Can't believe we got through so much and so clearly in that amount of time. But yes,
I
that
got my
does
watch
mean
here. That's how I was looking at the watch there, glancing at that.
perfectly done. So that does mean we do have 5 minutes now. If anybody would like to ask Ben any questions, either pop it in the chat. That was so interesting. As I say, flushes and springs is something that we quite regularly get emails about from our volunteers, and it is one of our less represented habitats. In fact, within the scheme, I think it can be a little bit off-putting. Perhaps people can feel a little bit nervous. So hopefully this will give folk a bit more confidence to get out there, find their flushes and springs and record. Lots of very big thank yous, Ben, coming up in the chat.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Another super presentation. Fantastic. No questions yet, though. This is brilliant. That's absolutely fab. But actually, that is a really good opportunity for me to say we do have another webinar coming up with Ben. I'm trying to think of the date of that. That's something a little bit different for NPMS. That's going to be looking at disturbed land and urban habitats. So that's a really interesting presentation coming up in our winter mini series. So do take a look at the webinar listings on our website for that. That's either towards the end of November, early December. So I do have one question for you here, Ben. What would you say are common threats, or perhaps things that can impact our flushes and springs?
Various ones, yeah. Eutrophication is one. Obviously, too much nutrient enrichment, like maybe seeping down slope from something else upslope. Trampling, over-trampling and disturbance, where there's vehicles, say, going through flushes, or a lot of livestock or deer in some places there. Although then, on the other hand, undergrazing can also ultimately lead to reduced plant species diversity, because it can lead to some species just thickening up at the expense of others. So kind of light to medium grazing and browsing can be a really good thing. So extremes of grazing and trampling at either end can be threats. And sometimes things like other human factors like road building, which is actually why we have this category called groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems, which are something that developers have to take note of if they've got a plan to do some development, like building tracks along a hillside, going to a wind farm. Somebody has to do surveys and figure out if you've got any GWDTEs, and then if there are, they've got to take special accounts of them. So there's pollution, another one, I suppose, atmospheric pollution, stuff getting into the water systems and coming down. That's linked with eutrophication.
Brilliant, thank you. It's really helpful. Got a question here regarding our negative indicators. So would you say that negative indicators are different for this habitat at a high altitude? So does the altitude of the site impact which species represent negative indicators?
I think it would, actually, because some of them, I'm just going to flick back to the page, some of these species you're just not going to see at high altitude. Himalayan balsam, stinging nettle hardly as well, and broadleaf and curled docks. One species that you can find coming into flushes well up in the hills, it's a non-native thing, is Epilobium brunescens, the New Zealand willow herb that I mentioned. Well, I didn't actually mention it verbally, but it's in one of these slides earlier on, because it looks a bit like Bob Pimpernel, little creeping thing with leaves in opposite pairs. And it likes kind of neutral to acidy or even base rich. Yeah, like springs and flushes well up in the hills. And that's kind of negative, but it doesn't really do serious damage. But yeah, some of these things, NPMS negative indicators, just don't apply really when you're high up in the hills. And the same for the wet heaths one as well. I think stinging nettle and creeping thistle are not so much things that you would get much of in the wet heaths anyway. So yeah, they do vary. They're, like a lot of these things, where you've got a list of positives or negatives, it's not the exact same list really applying to every example up and down the country and up, high up and low down. They do vary.
So just got time for just one more quick question that actually takes us back to the earlier question regarding sort of negative impacts on flushes and springs, and a question of, could shading out by new woodland have a negative impact, and would you say there are any recommendations about space to leave around flushes?
Yeah, it's possible that shading out could have an effect on some of these things, definitely, which is actually why, very much why, if there are things like tree planting proposals for new woodland, that if you've got one of those, some of those kind of habitats, GWDT, groundwater dependent terrestrial ecosystems, springs and flushes, there are recommendations to leave a good bit of a zone unplanted, quite a few meters to either side. Definitely was worth doing that. But it's also the case that often in some of these places where there's tree planting going on, it's not always mainly the tree shade from the trees that's going to be a potential threat to the ground vegetation. It can also be the removal of grazing to allow those trees to grow, because obviously if grazing carries on, they're going to nibble away the young trees. So it's very common to remove all grazing and to fence it all off from grazing when they put the young trees. And sometimes it's the grazing, the lack of grazing, that's the problem, because then you have a big thick sward of other species or common species thickening up, ousting out smaller ones in places where maybe actually a thin scatter of trees wouldn't have been a problem. If you could just go like that and the trees were there, it'd be great. But it's removing the grazing is often as much of a worry as shade from the trees. But yeah, dense tree canopy would definitely eliminate some of these flush and spring species in the long run if it got really dense.
Makes sense. Brilliant. Well, just last two final comments that I wanted to put up there. We've had a bit of a shout out for some astonishing flush communities up at Ranach Moor, and a question of if you visited that area and enjoyed these. Have
I visited the area? I've been across Ranach Moor many times on the road, of course, driving across. I've actually not wondered about the huge amounts on Ranach Moor itself. But there will be flushes in that part of the country. There's loads of really great ones, acid and base enriched ones. It's a great area, fantastic area.
Yeah. And just one last comment, just because I think it's possibly one of my favourite comments we've had on one of these sessions. Somebody saying one of the best presentations they've joined, all the better by seeing the legend that is Ben.
That's very kind.
So thank you very much for everything. So that's it. I think, yeah, we're just running over time now, so I will let everybody get back to their day and hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And a huge thanks again to echo everybody else here in chat. Thank you so much, Ben. And we're looking forward to your next session with us.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for participating today. It's great to have you all.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Bye now.